Story number 1.
We had always been a family that moved around a lot. My husband, James, and I both had jobs that required us to relocate every few years, and our two kids, Ben, who was 14, and Lily, who was 10, had grown used to it. The constant moving had become a part of our lives, and while it was difficult at times, we made it work. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared us for what happened when we moved into the house on Elm Street. It was a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and there was no traffic, just the sound of birds in the trees and kids riding their bikes down the street. The house was charming, a two-story colonial with a wraparound porch, a big backyard, and mature oak trees. The real estate agent had been eager to show us the property, claiming it had a lot of character, and we could already picture ourselves living there. We moved in during the middle of summer, and as we unloaded the boxes and set up the furniture, it felt like a fresh start. A clean slate. The house was everything we had been looking for. The high ceilings, the old hardwood floors, and even the slight creaks in the walls made it feel cozy, like the house was welcoming us in. The first few days went by without incident. But then things started to get strange. It was a Tuesday evening, and James had gone to work late. I had just finished putting the kids to bed and was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I heard a faint sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. After all, it was old. But then the sound grew louder. It was a scraping, dragging sound, like something heavy was being moved across the floor above me. I stood up, feeling a sudden unease settle in my chest. I called up to Ben and Lily, but there was no response. I checked their rooms. Both were sound asleep. I stood there for a moment listening, my heart pounding. The sound had stopped. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just a weird noise from the house, but a nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. The next morning, I mentioned it to James, but he didn't seem too concerned. "Probably just the house settling," he said with a shrug. "Old houses do that." But that night, the noise returned, and this time, it was louder. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and slow, walking across the floor above me. My heart raced. I could hear the floorboards creaking, one step after another. I grabbed my phone and texted James, but he didn't respond. I didn't want to wake the kids, so I decided to go up to the second floor myself to check it out. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I crept up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The doors to the bedrooms were all closed. I stood in the middle of the hallway for a moment, straining to hear any movement, but everything was still. I checked each room, but there was no one there. Everything looked normal. I went back downstairs, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But that night, the footsteps came again. This time they were different. They weren't just footsteps. There was a scratching sound mixed in, like nails dragging across wood. I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, I did some research. I found out that the house had a strange history. It had been built in the 1920s, and the previous owners had lived there for over 30 years. They were an elderly couple, and after the husband passed away, the wife had lived alone for a few years before moving to a nursing home. The house had been empty for almost a year before we moved in. I reached out to the neighbors, hoping to learn more about the house's history. An older woman down the street, Mrs. Walker, had lived in the area for decades. She seemed hesitant at first, but eventually told me that there had been rumors about the house. Apparently, there had been strange occurrences in the past. The elderly woman who lived there had never spoken about it, but neighbors reported hearing odd noises, seeing lights turn on and off at odd hours, and even feeling a strange presence in the house when they visited. "Some people say it's haunted," Mrs. Walker said softly. "But no one really knows for sure." I didn't know what to think. Could it really be haunted? Was I just letting my imagination get the best of me? I tried to dismiss it, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. That night, James and I decided to stay up and try to figure out what was causing the noises. We turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, listening. For a while, there was nothing. Then, just as we were about to give up, we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. James stood up, his face pale. That's not normal. We both grabbed flashlights and went upstairs, shining them into each room. The noise seemed to be coming from the attic. James went first, pulling down the ladder that led to the attic hatch. The air up there was thick with dust and the space smelled musty. We stepped cautiously into the attic, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. There was nothing, no sign of anything or anyone, just boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. But then we saw it. At the far corner of the attic, there was a large wooden chest. It wasn't something we had noticed before. It seemed out of place. James walked over to it, hesitating for just a moment before opening it. Inside were old clothes, some books, and a faded photograph. He picked it up, and for the first time, I saw his face change. This is the woman who lived here before us, he said, holding up the photo. It was a black and white picture of an elderly woman standing in front of the house. The woman had a stern expression, her eyes cold and lifeless. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at the camera. We didn't know what to make of it, but the air in the attic suddenly felt heavier, suffocating. It was as if we weren't alone anymore. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. James closed the chest quickly, and we both rushed downstairs, trying to shake off the sense of dread that had settled over us. The days that followed were a blur. The noises continued, always at night, always when we least expected them. I started feeling like I was constantly on edge, like something was watching me. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of breathing, soft and shallow, coming from the hallway outside our bedroom. I would check, but no one would be there. The kids had started to complain about bad dreams, and Ben even started sleepwalking. One night, after another round of footsteps and scratching sounds, I went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I turned on the tap, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window above the sink. A shadow. A figure standing just outside. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I slowly turned around, but there was no one there. I ran to the door and flung it open, but the porch was empty. I stepped outside, looking around the yard, but I saw nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind. When I went back inside, I locked all the doors and checked every window. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I stayed up that night, sitting on the couch with the lights on, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Around 2 a.m., the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't at the door. It was coming from inside the house, from the walls themselves. It was as if someone was banging on the walls trying to get out. I ran up to the kids' rooms, checking on them, but they were both asleep, unaware of the chaos unfolding around us. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I called a local paranormal investigator, someone recommended by a friend. He came over that afternoon, bringing equipment to detect electromagnetic fields, EVP recorders, and cameras. He seemed skeptical at first, but when he started setting up his gear, he grew quiet, his face serious. "It's active," he said, glancing at his devices. "There's definitely something here." That evening, we sat together, watching the monitors as the investigator set up his cameras. The atmosphere in the house was tense, almost oppressive. We watched as the cameras picked up strange, shadowy figures moving through the hallways and the attic where the chest had been found. The sounds of footsteps grew louder and the temperature in certain rooms dropped significantly. It was clear something or someone was in the house. "I think it's tied to the woman in the photo," the investigator said. "She might have died here. Maybe her spirit never left." We didn't stay much longer after that. We packed up, left the house, and never returned. The house on Elm Street is still there, waiting for someone else to move in. I've heard it's been sold again, but I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of being trapped in that house, knowing we weren't the only ones living there. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I moved into the house at the edge of town in the fall of 2019. I had been looking for a quiet, somewhat remote place to retreat to after my divorce. The city had become overwhelming, and the endless noise, bright lights, and crowds had left me feeling drained. I found an old farmhouse that had been vacant for a few months, and the price was right. The house was charming, albeit a bit worn, and had a certain rustic appeal that made it feel like home from the moment I stepped through the front door. The first few weeks went smoothly. I spent my time unpacking, cleaning, and settling into the house. The large windows let in beautiful natural light, and the creaky wooden floors added character. The garden was overgrown, but that was part of the charm. The quiet of the area was exactly what I needed to escape the bustle of city life. There were no close neighbors, and the street was empty most of the time. It was perfect, or so I thought. It started with the noises. At first, they were faint, easy to ignore, soft thumps like footsteps overhead or in the walls. I figured it was just the house settling. Old houses creak and groan all the time, right? But the sounds didn't stop. In fact, they started to grow more frequent and more distinct. I began hearing the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs in the middle of the night. The first time I heard it, I was already in bed, exhausted from unpacking all day. The stairs were creaky, but these steps were heavy, deliberate, and seemed to come from upstairs. I froze, heart pounding. I had been living alone since moving in, so the thought of someone else being in the house was unsettling to say the least. But when I finally got the courage to get out of bed and check, there was no one there. The house was quiet, empty, as it should be. Still, the feeling of someone else being there lingered. Over the next few days, the noises continued, always at night. At first, I told myself I was just adjusting to the house. Maybe the house had a history, and the sounds were just remnants of its past. But then came the whispers. One night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough that it sent a chill down my spine. It was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. At first, I thought it was a dream, but as I listened, it became clearer. A low, raspy whisper repeating over and over again, "Go, go." My heart raced, and I lay frozen in bed, unsure of what to do. I didn't dare get up, not sure if I was really hearing it or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I closed my eyes tightly, hoping it was just my imagination. But the whispering didn't stop. It went on for what felt like hours, becoming more insistent with each repetition. "Go, go," it urged, as if it wanted me to leave. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the whispering ceased. The silence was deafening. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to dismiss the incident. Maybe it was a dream, I thought. Maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the house was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Over the following days, the house seemed to grow colder, especially at night. Even when I set the thermostat high, the chill wouldn't go away. It wasn't just a physical cold, though. It felt like something was seeping into my very bones, like the house itself was a living entity that resented my presence. As the weeks passed, the disturbances grew more intense. I started to see things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows moving across the walls, figures that seemed to flicker and vanish when I turned to look directly at them. One night, as I was reading in the living room, I felt something, someone, standing just behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty, yet the feeling of being watched lingered, pressing on my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I began to avoid certain rooms in the house. The upstairs hallway, in particular, gave me a sense of dread. It felt as if something was standing just beyond my sight, waiting for me to approach. But it wasn't just the physical space that unsettled me. It was the oppressive atmosphere in the house. I began to feel like I was living in a tomb, trapped in a place that wanted to keep me. I wondered if I was just imagining everything, if the stress of my divorce and moving into a new house had gotten to me. But the events kept happening, one after another, until I could no longer deny that something was wrong. One night, things escalated to a level I couldn't explain away. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening upstairs. I froze. My mind raced. There was no one else in the house. I hadn't heard anyone come in or leave. The door opened again, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the stairs. Panic surged through me as I listened, my breath coming in short gasps. I stood up, heart pounding, and slowly made my way toward the staircase. I could hear the footsteps clearly now, just a few steps behind me. My legs were shaking as I ascended the stairs, my eyes glued to the dark hallway above. There was no one there. No one at all. I checked every room, every closet, every corner of the second floor, but the house was empty. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It was as if something or someone was still lingering in the air, invisible but present. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers returned, but this time they were louder, clearer. "Leave," they said. "Leave now. It's not safe." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to get out of that house. It felt like I was being haunted, like whatever was in the house didn't want me there. I considered calling a priest or a paranormal investigator, but I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy. I had to figure this out myself. The following day, I decided to take action. I called up a local paranormal group, hoping they could provide some answers. A woman named Sarah, who had been investigating hauntings for years, agreed to come over and conduct an investigation. When Sarah arrived, she immediately seemed to sense the heaviness in the air. She walked through the house, her eyes narrowing as she listened to the creaks of the floorboards and the low hum of the house. "There's something here," she said, her voice low and serious. "This house has a history. It's been through a lot." She explained that sometimes when a house has seen trauma or violence, the spirits that remain can become trapped, angry, or vengeful. She asked if I knew anything about the history of the house, and I realized that I didn't. The real estate agent hadn't mentioned anything about the house's past, and the property had been vacant for years. Sarah suggested performing a cleansing ritual, something to rid the house of whatever was lingering. I agreed, desperate for any solution. She set up candles and incense in the living room, chanting softly in a language I didn't understand. She asked me to sit quietly and focus on the space around me as she worked. As she spoke, the temperature in the room dropped. I could feel it, a coldness seeping into my skin, despite the heat I had running in the house. The whispering started again, louder this time, echoing through the room. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath as the voices seemed to grow louder. "Leave," they said. "You're not welcome." But as Sarah continued the ritual, the voices grew fainter. The chill in the air began to recede, and the oppressive feeling in the room seemed to lift. When she finished, she looked at me with a tired but reassuring smile. "It's done," she said. "The house should be clear now." The change was immediate. The temperature returned to normal, and the heaviness in the air dissipated. The whispers stopped, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I was finally able to sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat, listening for footsteps or waiting for the whispers to begin. That was months ago. I still live in the house, though I no longer feel the same sense of dread that I once did. The house feels peaceful now, calm, but sometimes late at night when the wind howls outside and the house creaks in the silence, I can't help but wonder, was the house truly cleansed, or is there something still waiting in the shadows, just beyond my reach? Story the end.
Story number 3.
We moved into the house on Maple Street in the early spring, excited to start fresh. The house was a 2-story Victorian, built in the early 1900s. It had all the charm we were looking for, with high ceilings, original woodwork, and a large wraparound porch. The neighborhood was quiet, and though it was an older area of town, there was a certain charm in the faded grandeur of the place. When we first saw it, we could already picture ourselves living there, raising our kids in a home that was full of history. My husband, Peter, and I, along with our 2 kids, Sophie, who was 10, and Jake, who was 8, had been looking for a place like this for years. We'd been living in a small, cramped apartment, and we were ready to settle into something permanent. The house was perfect, and after a quick inspection and a few phone calls to the real estate agent, we made an offer. It was accepted, and we moved in within a few weeks. The first few days were exciting, organizing furniture, decorating the kids' rooms, and getting everything in place. But from the beginning, there were strange things happening that we couldn't explain. At first, they were small, insignificant occurrences that we brushed off as the quirks of an old house. Doors creaked, the plumbing made strange noises, and the house seemed to settle and groan at odd hours. We told ourselves it was just part of the house's character, but then the noises started. It was a Tuesday night when it began. I was upstairs putting Jake to bed, and Peter was downstairs finishing dinner. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that you can only find in a place that has lived through decades of time. Jake had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted from a busy day of playing outside, and I stood in his doorway for a moment, watching him sleep. It was then that I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Peter coming upstairs, but when I listened closely, the footsteps were coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the house. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I stood still, straining to hear more. There was no one else home, and the sound was too odd to ignore. My heart started to race as I slowly walked down the hallway and down the stairs. The sound was louder now, echoing through the house. It was as if it was coming from the basement, though that seemed impossible. Peter was cooking dinner. I hadn't seen him go downstairs, and I had heard him earlier when he was upstairs. I made my way to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. I hesitated, but the curiosity was too much. I opened the door and shone my phone's flashlight down the dark staircase. The footsteps stopped as soon as I stepped into the basement doorway. The air felt thick, cold in a way that made my skin crawl. I waited for a moment, listening, but nothing happened. I went back upstairs, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had crept over me. "Peter?" I called. He was standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. "What's up?" he asked, looking up. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Hear what?" he said, looking confused. "Footsteps, coming from the basement," I replied, feeling foolish now. "It's probably nothing, but—" Peter chuckled. "It's an old house, Han. It probably creaked from settling or something. Don't worry about it." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. Still, I let it go, thinking maybe I had just imagined it. The next few days passed without incident, and we began to settle into our routine. Then, the knocking started. It was the following Saturday morning, just after breakfast. I was in the living room with Sophie and Jake, putting together a puzzle, when we heard a series of sharp, deliberate knocks on the front door. 3, to be exact. I froze, my eyes darting to the door. "Who's that?" Sophie asked, looking up from the puzzle. I walked over to the door and peeked through the peephole. There was no one there. No one in sight. I opened the door, scanning the front porch and yard, but there was nothing. I checked the door frame, the windows, and even the driveway, but the street outside was completely empty. "Must have been the wind," I muttered to myself, closing the door and locking it again. The kids didn't seem too concerned, and Peter was busy in the kitchen, so I didn't say anything. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, the knocking came again. It was around midnight. I had just drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by the sound of knocking on our bedroom door. 3 sharp knocks, followed by a brief pause, and then another round of knocks. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. "Peter," I whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "Peter, wake up." He groggily looked at me. "What is it? Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He listened for a moment, but the knocking had stopped. "I didn't hear anything," he replied, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just the house settling again." But I knew it wasn't. This was different. The knocking had come from the door to our room, and it wasn't the sound of the house settling. It was too purposeful. Peter seemed unconvinced, so I reluctantly went back to sleep, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. The next few nights, the knocking grew more frequent. At random times during the night, we would hear those sharp, rhythmic knocks. Sometimes it was at the door to our room. Sometimes it was coming from the hallway outside. But no matter where it came from, it was always the same. 3 knocks, a pause, and then another 3. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I called Peter's brother, Mike, who was a carpenter, to come over and check the house for any issues. Maybe there was some kind of structural problem causing the strange noises. Mike came over the next afternoon. He inspected the doors, windows, and even the walls, but he couldn't find anything unusual. "I don't know what to tell you," he said, shrugging. "It's an old house, so things settle, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the structure." We were both frustrated, but I couldn't ignore the sense of dread that had settled in my chest. The house felt off. Every corner of it felt cold, like something was lurking just out of sight. Sophie and Jake had started complaining about hearing things, too. Whispers, voices in the walls, shadows moving in their rooms when the lights were off. One night, I decided to confront whatever was in the house. I went to the basement where I had first heard the footsteps. It was cold down there, colder than the rest of the house. I walked to the far corner of the basement near the old furnace, and that's when I saw it. There was a small, faded portrait on the wall, a family standing together, their faces solemn. I didn't recognize them, but something about the picture felt wrong. The mother in the portrait had cold, lifeless eyes, and her expression was stern, almost angry. I felt a chill run through me as I stared at it, something deep in my gut telling me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to figure out who they were. I spent the next few days digging into the history of the house. I went to the local library and researched the previous owners. It turned out that the house had been built in the early 1900s by a wealthy family named the Blackwells. They had lived there for many years before the patriarch Samuel Blackwell passed away in the 1940s. His wife, Eleanor, continued to live there until her death in the 1960s. There was a brief mention of the house being sold after her passing, but not much else. What I found next was disturbing. Eleanor Blackwell had been known to have a volatile temper. Neighbors reported strange occurrences during her time in the house, lights turning on and off by themselves, windows opening on their own, and even voices coming from empty rooms. Some believed Eleanor's spirit never left the house, that she was angry and restless after her death. The more I learned, the more I realized that whatever was haunting us had been in that house long before we ever moved in. I began to feel like we were intruders in someone else's home, and the presence of Eleanor Blackwell was closing in on us. That night, the knocking came again, only this time it wasn't just at the door. It came from the walls, from every corner of the house. I could hear the scratching and tapping, the whispers and the breathing. It felt like the walls themselves were alive, closing in on us. We couldn't take it any longer. The next morning, we packed our bags, gathered the kids, and left. We didn't look back. The house on Maple Street still stands, empty and silent. The knocking, the footsteps, the whispers, they are still there, waiting for the next family to move in. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I was 23 when I moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, and the place seemed perfect for a fresh start. I had just gotten out of a long relationship and needed a quiet, peaceful place to gather my thoughts and escape the noise of the city. The house itself was charming, with a wraparound porch and overgrown ivy creeping up its sides. It sat on a large plot of land, surrounded by trees that whispered in the wind. It felt like the kind of place I could settle into, find my peace, and heal. The first few weeks were idyllic. The silence was comforting, the stillness refreshing. I spent my time getting to know the house, cleaning, rearranging, and making it feel like my own. I even took on a small gardening project, though the land had been neglected for years. The house was old, of course, creaky floors, drafty windows, a few too many cobwebs, but it had character, and the feeling of having a place to call my own, even if temporary, felt liberating. But as I spent more time in the house, I began to notice things. At first, they were small, easily explained away. The creak of the floorboards when I was alone, the occasional cold draft in rooms that should have been warm, the soft sound of something moving in the attic late at night. I convinced myself that it was just the house settling. After all, it was old. What was there to be afraid of? Then the dreams started. At first, they were subtle. Shadows in the corners of my room, whispers I couldn't make out, figures that seemed to loom over me as I slept. But they grew more vivid with each passing night. One evening, I woke up in the middle of a dream, gasping for breath, only to find myself staring into the dark shadows of my room. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and for the first time since moving in, I was afraid. A few days later, I began hearing the footsteps. They were faint at first, light, almost imperceptible. I heard them from the hallway outside my room, and I assumed they were just the sounds of the old house, creaking as it settled. But when they continued, night after night, I began to question whether it was something more. It felt like someone was walking up and down the hallway, waiting just outside my door, but whenever I would open it to investigate, there was never anyone there. The house would be silent, just as it should be. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was just old, and I was letting my imagination get the best of me. After all, nothing had happened to make me truly afraid, right? I convinced myself to keep going, to ignore the creeping sense of unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. But the sounds continued. Then came the night of the tapping. It was about 3 weeks into my stay. I had just returned home from a long day at work, exhausted and eager to collapse into bed. I set down my things and moved into the kitchen to start dinner. That's when I heard the sound. Soft at first, like a tap, tap, tap against the front door. I froze, the sound immediately cutting through the calm of the house. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or perhaps someone who had lost their way. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. I stepped outside, the crisp night air rushing to meet me, and I scanned the yard. The trees were still, and the yard was empty. There was no sign of anyone. I quickly closed the door, shaking my head, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just imagined it. But the tapping came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed through the house, reverberating through the walls. It came from the front door, but I couldn't bring myself to open it again. I stood still, frozen in place. The air felt heavier now, as though the house itself was pressing in on me. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The tapping continued for what felt like an eternity before it finally stopped. I cautiously approached the door again and peeked out the window. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anything. I was alone. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, a tree branch tapping against the door, or something else rational. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The tapping had been too deliberate, too purposeful to be anything other than a message or a warning. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt alive, filled with unseen eyes that were watching me. The darkness seemed to stretch on, suffocating the small bedroom I had made my own. I kept hearing things, scratching sounds, faint whispers, and the ever-present tapping that seemed to echo in my mind. It wasn't until a few nights later that things took a much darker turn. I had just finished dinner and was relaxing on the couch when I heard a crash from upstairs. It was unmistakable, a loud, sharp noise like something heavy being thrown to the ground. My heart skipped a beat, and I rushed up the stairs to investigate. When I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. The door to the spare bedroom was wide open, and the room was in complete disarray. The dresser had been overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. The bed had been pulled away from the wall, and the windows were wide open, allowing the night air to rush in. But there was no sign of anyone. I stepped into the room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My mind raced. I had not been in this room since I moved in. There was no reason for the room to be disturbed like this. It was as though someone, or something, had been waiting for me. I quickly turned and left the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. It felt as though the house was alive with an energy I couldn't explain. It felt oppressive, malevolent even. The next day, I called the landlord to inquire about the history of the house. I had to know if anyone had lived there before me. Maybe someone had passed away there, or something tragic had occurred that could explain the strange occurrences. The landlord's voice was calm, but hesitant when he answered. He told me that the house had been vacant for years. He mentioned a few brief tenants, but no one had stayed for long. He didn't seem to know much about the house's history, but there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't telling me the full story. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt colder than usual, even though the temperature outside was warm. I could hear the creaks of the floorboards beneath my feet, but this time, it wasn't just the house settling. This time, the creaks were accompanied by the sound of footsteps coming from behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The house was empty, just like it should be. The footsteps continued, growing louder and closer. I could feel my heart racing in my chest as I backed away from the hallway. It was as if someone was following me, stalking me through the house. The whispers returned, and I could hear them clearly now. Leave, get out. I ran downstairs and bolted the front door behind me, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the locks. The night air was cool against my skin, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I had no idea what was haunting me, but it was clear that it didn't want me there. I spent the next few nights in a hotel, too afraid to return to the house. But eventually I went back, hoping the strange occurrences would stop. I knew that I couldn't let whatever was in the house drive me out. But when I walked through the front door, I could feel it. The house had changed. It was darker now, colder. The air felt thick with something I couldn't see, but I could sense it, feel it pressing against my skin. And that's when I saw him. At the end of the hallway, standing in the shadows, was a figure. He was tall, thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. He wasn't quite human, and yet he was. His face was pale, gaunt, and he seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I froze in place, unable to speak, unable to move. The whispers grew louder, and I could hear them clearly now, all around me. Get out now. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the front door and bolted it behind me. I left the house that night, and I didn't look back. I never returned to that farmhouse, and to this day I still don't know what it was that haunted me. I often wonder if it's still there, waiting for its next victim. But I do know one thing. Some places are best left alone. Some houses are meant to remain empty, and some things are best left undisturbed. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I never believed in ghosts, not in the way that some people did. I always thought it was just an overactive imagination or a way for people to make sense of things they couldn't explain. But that all changed when I moved into the house on Elm Street. It was an old place, built in the early 1900s, with a lot of charm, though admittedly it had seen better days. The rent was cheap, and I needed somewhere to stay after a messy breakup. The house had been on the market for a while, and the landlord seemed eager to get someone in there. I was desperate to escape the chaos of city life, and this house, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, seemed like the perfect place to retreat. The place had a certain appeal, with its creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and massive windows that let in the afternoon sun. The first few weeks felt like a dream, quiet and serene. I took long walks around the neighborhood, just had a few friends over, and started to feel at home. But as time passed, strange things began to happen. It started with small things that could easily be ignored. The flickering of lights, the soft sound of someone walking up the stairs when I knew I was the only one in the house. But these things were subtle, and I convinced myself that it was all in my head. The house was old, after all. Houses like this make strange noises, right? Then, one evening, it happened. I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard a loud bang from the kitchen. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up and walked cautiously into the kitchen, expecting to find a dish or cup on the floor. But nothing was out of place. The kitchen was perfectly clean, the floor spotless. There was no sign of anything having fallen. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had blown something over, or perhaps a rat had knocked something in the walls. But then it happened again. The banging noise, but this time it was followed by a soft whispering, a murmur of voices that seemed to come from nowhere. I rushed to the windows, opened them, and looked outside to see if anyone was near. The street was empty. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of the trees in the wind. I closed the windows, feeling a chill crawl up my spine, and went to bed. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept the lights on, trying to fall asleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt a presence in the room with me. The next day, I called the landlord. I asked if anyone else had ever reported strange occurrences in the house, but he laughed it off, telling me it was just an old house with a few quirks. But something in his voice didn't sit right with me. He seemed too eager to dismiss my concerns. Over the following days, things escalated. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until one night, as I was sitting at the dining table, I could hear clear words. It was a woman's voice, low and cold, saying my name, calling me from the hallway. My blood ran cold. I stood up, my heart racing, but when I walked to the hallway, no one was there. The house was still, but I knew what I had heard. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the house, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Then one night, it all came crashing down. I had spent most of the evening watching TV in the living room, and around midnight, I decided to go to bed. As I walked up the stairs, I heard a loud creak behind me, as if someone was following. I spun around, but no one was there. I rushed up the stairs, my mind racing with panic. As I entered the bedroom and turned on the light, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The mirror that hung on the wall was cracked. The glass was jagged, the cracks spidering across the surface. I had never noticed it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. I walked up to it, my reflection staring back at me with confusion, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't just the crack in the mirror that unsettled me, it was the faint image in the reflection, something that wasn't there when I turned around. It was a figure, standing behind me. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but when I turned around, no one was there. The figure in the mirror was tall, shadowy, with no distinct features. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and I stumbled back. My heart was pounding in my chest as I quickly turned off the light, hoping to shake off the terror. That night, I locked the door, but sleep didn't come. I lay there in the dark, listening to the soft whispers that seemed to be coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The house felt alive, but not in the comforting way that an old home sometimes does. It felt suffocating, oppressive, like something was breathing just out of reach. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I was alone in the house, I felt that same sense of being watched, followed, as if something was lurking just beyond my line of sight. The footsteps grew louder, always behind me, following me up and down the stairs, pacing in the halls. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. It was on the fifth night that everything reached its breaking point. I was in the living room, trying to watch TV, when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, but this time they were heavy, deliberate, like someone was stomping across the floor. I froze. The footsteps came closer, closer, until they were right outside the door. My heart was in my throat as I stood up, slowly walking toward the door. I opened it, but there was no one there. I stepped into the hallway, my hand shaking as I reached for the light switch. That's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, in the dim light of the living room, a shadow moved. It was human-shaped, tall and thin, but the edges of the figure blurred, like smoke, like it didn't quite belong. My breath caught in my chest as I watched it move closer. I backed up, my feet stumbling over the floorboards as I rushed toward the front door. But before I could make it, I felt something grab me. It wasn't a physical hand, but a force, a pressure on my shoulders that stopped me in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around, but there was no one there. The pressure released, and I bolted for the door, throwing it open and stepping outside into the cold night air. I didn't go back to the house that night. I stayed with a friend, too terrified to sleep in my own bed. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him I was moving out. He was angry, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there, needed to leave before whatever was in that house could hurt me. I didn't care about the lease or the money or anything else. I just needed to leave. I packed up what little I had left in the house and drove away, not once looking back. It took me weeks to shake off the feeling that something was following me, something lingering in the shadows of my mind. But I never went back to that house. I never found out who or what had been haunting me. All I knew was that I had to get out, or I would never escape it. To this day, I don't know what it was, but I do know that I will never live in a house like that again. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had always been the type of person who loved a good mystery. I enjoyed horror films, the suspenseful thrill of a ghost story, but I never thought for a second that anything like that could ever happen to me. I used to think the people who claimed they had experienced hauntings were either mistaken or exaggerating. That all changed the day I moved into the old house on Highland Avenue. It was a fixer-upper, one that had been sitting empty for several years. The house was a beautiful Victorian-style home built in the 1800s. From the moment I first walked through the front door, I knew it had potential. The wooden floors creaked with age, the walls had a charm to them, even if they were in desperate need of a fresh coat of paint, and the large windows let in an abundance of natural light. It felt like the perfect place to start fresh after a turbulent period in my life. I had just gone through a difficult breakup and wanted to put everything behind me. I signed the lease immediately, eager to move in and begin the process of making the house my own. The first few days were peaceful, almost idyllic. The neighborhood was quiet, the air crisp, and the old house offered a sense of solitude that I had been craving. I spent my evenings unpacking, organizing my things, and getting to know the quirks of the place. The odd squeaks in the floorboards, the peculiar way the door to the attic would sometimes creak open on its own. But I dismissed it all. After all, old houses made strange noises, and I had enough on my plate to worry about. It wasn't until the third night that things started to feel off. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when I heard the faint sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps, as though someone was walking slowly upstairs. I froze, holding my breath. But no one was there. I had checked when I came in, and I was the only one in the house. I chalked it up to the house settling, the old wood creaking under its own weight. The sound continued over the next few days, soft footsteps, always coming from the second floor. I began to feel a sense of unease, but I told myself I was just imagining things. I didn't want to seem paranoid, especially in my new home. However, there was one night that I will never forget. I had just come back from work, feeling particularly drained after a long day. I walked into the living room and noticed something strange. The curtains were drawn back, even though I had left them closed that morning. At first, I thought I might have accidentally left them open when I left, but as I walked past them, a cold chill washed over me. It was like the temperature had dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath fogging up in the air. Then I heard it. Whispers. Soft, indistinct voices coming from the direction of the stairs. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words, but it was like the voices were muffled by something. I told myself it was just the wind. Perhaps a draft was carrying sounds from outside, or the old pipes were making strange noises. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I went to the kitchen, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I turned on the kettle for some tea, my hands shaking slightly. Just as I turned back toward the hallway, I saw it. A shadow. A shadow that moved across the wall as if something was walking through the living room. I immediately turned on the lights, but when I looked around, there was nothing there. Nothing at all. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the house creaking or the whispering voices. It was the overwhelming sensation that I was not alone. The next few days felt like a blur. I tried to go about my normal routine, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I could feel eyes on me when I was in the kitchen, when I was in the bathroom, even when I was lying in bed at night. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself that it was just the stress of adjusting to a new place. But then came the night when everything changed. I had been in the attic that evening, sifting through old boxes left by previous tenants. The attic had a musty smell, but it was also the one part of the house that hadn't been renovated. It was dark up there, with only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. As I was going through the boxes, I came across an old photograph album. The cover was dusty, but I carefully opened it, and inside were black and white photos of people from a time long ago. The pages were yellowed with age, and the faces in the photographs seemed oddly stiff, like they were frozen in time. The last photograph in the album caught my attention. It was a picture of a family standing in front of the house, but something about it made my stomach drop. In the background, through the foggy glass of the window, I could make out a shadowy figure. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. The figure was tall and thin, almost gaunt, and it appeared to be watching the family. I slammed the album shut, a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I felt like I had just uncovered something that should have been left buried. I quickly left the attic and went back downstairs, my heart racing. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every gust of wind felt amplified, as though the house was holding its breath. And then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, the sound of footsteps again, this time much closer. I opened my eyes, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was a figure. It was tall, like the one in the photograph, but this time, it was real. I could see its features, pale skin, hollow eyes, and a mouth that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, trapped in place by an invisible force. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually the figure disappeared. The room fell silent, and I could move again, though I felt drained like I had just run a marathon. I immediately got up, rushed to the door, and ran outside into the cold night air. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. I spent the night at a friend's house, not knowing what to do. I wanted to leave, to run far away from the house, but I had nowhere to go. The next day, I called the landlord, asking if there had ever been any strange occurrences in the house. He was quiet for a long time before admitting that the house had a history. Several people had lived there over the years, but the previous tenants had left abruptly, citing strange noises and an oppressive atmosphere. He assured me it was all just rumors, but I didn't believe him. The haunting continued, the footsteps, the whispers, the cold spots. It was as if the house itself was alive, and it didn't want me there. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and left. I didn't care about the lease or the money. I just had to get out. The landlord called me several times after I moved out, asking why I left so suddenly, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what I had experienced. I knew he wouldn't believe me anyway. I never returned to that house, and I never looked back. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I don't know who or what was haunting that house, but I know that whatever it was, it didn't want me there. I've never lived in a house since then that felt so suffocating, so full of dread. I still have nightmares sometimes, dreams of that figure standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I often wonder about the family in the photograph. Who were they? What happened to them? And most of all, I wonder if the figure in the window was watching them, just like it watched me. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I had always considered myself a skeptic. I grew up in a household where rational explanations were the default, and supernatural occurrences were dismissed as figments of an overactive imagination. I never believed in ghosts or spirits, and I certainly didn't believe that anything unexplainable could happen in the real world. That was until I moved into the old house on Maple Street. I was looking for a new place to live after a recent breakup. I had spent months in a tiny apartment with thin walls, listening to the sounds of my neighbors' lives, and I needed a change. The house I found on Maple Street was perfect, charming, spacious, and affordable. It had been on the market for a while, which at the time seemed like a bonus. The price was right, and the house had character. It was a century-old home, with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and large windows that let in sunlight. The kind of place that felt like it had a story to tell. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt at ease. There was a sense of comfort, as though the house welcomed me. I was in a rush to move in, and the landlord seemed eager to get it off his hands. It was clear that the house needed work. There were spots on the walls where the paint had chipped and some of the floors creaked ominously, but I didn't mind. I saw the potential. The first few days passed in peaceful tranquility. I spent most of my time unpacking and adjusting to my new life. The neighborhood was quiet, and the neighbors were friendly, though none of them had lived in the area for long. There was a strange sense of solitude, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a welcome change. However, after a week or so, I began to notice strange things. At first, they were subtle, little things that could be easily explained away. Doors left slightly ajar when I was certain I had closed them. A light that would flicker on and off without warning. I thought nothing of it. Old houses have their quirks, right? Then, one night, the sounds began. It started with footsteps. At first, I assumed it was the house settling, as old houses tend to do, but the sound of slow, deliberate steps, like someone was walking across the floor upstairs, began to happen at night. I would lie in bed, wide awake, listening to the rhythmic footsteps. Sometimes it would sound like someone was pacing the hallway above me. At first, I chalked it up to the old pipes or the house's natural noises. But when the footsteps became more pronounced, more deliberate, I began to wonder. I decided to investigate. One night, when the footsteps began again, I stood up and crept quietly to the stairs. The floorboards creaked under my feet and I froze. The sounds had stopped. I stood at the foot of the stairs, listening intently, but all was silent. I took a deep breath and slowly climbed the stairs. When I reached the top, I noticed that the hallway light, which I had left off, was now on. I walked cautiously toward the end of the hallway where the stairs to the attic were. The air felt cold, unnaturally cold. I stopped just before the attic door, my heart racing. There was nothing, no one. The door to the attic was shut, just as I had left it. But something about it felt off. It was as though the air in the hallway had thickened, like a presence was waiting. I reached for the door handle and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the dim, dusty attic. I turned on the light and looked around. The room was exactly as it had been when I moved in, packed with old furniture, boxes, and discarded items. There was no one in the attic, but the strange sense of unease didn't lift. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the room, a shadow that seemed to move. My blood ran cold. I spun around, my breath shallow, my pulse racing. But the shadow was gone. There was nothing there. I stood in the attic, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, a shift in my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I quickly left the attic and shut the door behind me, my heart pounding. The days that followed were a blur of strange occurrences. Things would disappear and then reappear in odd places. My keys, my phone, a pair of shoes. I'd hear muffled voices at night, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. It was always late when I was alone, and it felt as though the house was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't quite understand what. I called the landlord several times, but he assured me that the house was perfectly safe. He didn't seem to take my concerns seriously, dismissing them as normal quirks of an old house. But it was hard to ignore the growing sense that something was wrong. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch, I heard it again, the footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. This time, however, there was a difference. It wasn't just walking. It was as if something or someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I stood up, my legs trembling, and made my way upstairs. But this time, when I reached the hallway, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. A low, guttural whisper, as though someone was speaking directly into my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, threatening, chilling. I stumbled backward, feeling the walls close in on me. My heart was racing, my body frozen in place. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. That's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, standing in front of the attic door, was a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette, just standing there. I couldn't see any details, no face, just the outline of something tall and thin, like a person, but not quite. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in place, but eventually, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, vanishing into thin air. I ran downstairs and out of the house, not looking back. That night, I stayed at a friend's house, too terrified to return to my own. The next morning, I called the landlord once again, demanding that he send someone to check the house. But once again, he brushed it off, telling me I was just imagining things. After that, I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up my things, moved out, and never looked back. I don't know what I experienced in that house, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the coldness that crept into the rooms, the whispering voices that seemed to follow me. The house on Maple Street is still there, still standing, waiting for the next tenant to move in. I've heard rumors that others have experienced similar things, but I don't know if that's true. I haven't been back. But I do know one thing. After living there, I'll never be able to shake the feeling that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that we can't outrun. And sometimes those things come looking for you. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I never believed in ghosts, at least not until I moved into that old house. It had always been a bit of a joke among my friends and family. The haunted house I decided to call home. It wasn't really haunted, I told myself at first, just an old place with creaky floors and drafty windows, things that could be explained away. That's what I thought anyway, until the events of that summer shattered my skepticism completely. The house wasn't much to look at. 2 stories, white paint chipped by years of weather, a small front yard that needed a lot of attention, and a backyard with overgrown grass that looked like it hadn't been mowed in years. But I was tired of city living and wanted a place I could really settle into. So when the opportunity to rent it came up, I jumped at it. The price was low, too low for the size of the house. I should have known that something was off, but I was too eager to escape the noise and stress of city life to question it. It was a quaint little house, the kind you see in old movies, with winding stairs and big windows that let in sunlight in the morning. But there was something about it, an undercurrent of unease, that I couldn't quite place. But I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the odd charm of an old home. I moved in quickly, not wasting any time. The first few days were fine. The house creaked, of course. Old houses do that. The floorboards groaned underfoot and the windows rattled when the wind blew. But that didn't bother me. I liked it. It felt cozy, and I loved the peaceful quiet of the neighborhood. The first incident happened just a week after I'd moved in. It was late, and I was in the kitchen making myself a cup of tea when I heard a soft tapping sound from upstairs. It wasn't like the usual house noises I had gotten used to. This was rhythmic, almost deliberate. I paused, the cup halfway to my lips, straining my ears to listen. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a branch scraping against the window or the house settling. But then the tapping came again, louder this time. I felt a strange chill crawl up my spine, but I brushed it off. It was probably a rodent or something, I thought. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went upstairs to investigate. The house was eerily silent as I walked down the hallway toward the source of the sound. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached the end of the hall, where the door to the guest room stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open, feeling a rush of cold air hit my face. Nothing. There was nothing in the room. The window was closed, and the air smelled stale, like it had been locked up for years. I checked the closet, the corners, every possible hiding spot, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Just an old, dusty room. I exhaled, feeling foolish for getting so worked up over a little noise. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The house felt different, as if it was alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was imagining things, but I couldn't fall asleep. Every creak, every gust of wind seemed magnified, and the silence of the house weighed heavily on me. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. It started small. Objects out of place, things I could have sworn I had left in one spot, only to find them moved when I returned. I'd find my keys on the kitchen counter when I was sure I'd left them in the living room. The remote control would be in the bathroom, and a book I had put down in one room would turn up on the stairs. At first, I chalked it up to forgetfulness or perhaps just being distracted. I had recently moved into a new place, after all, and I was still adjusting to the change. But as the days went by, the feeling of unease grew stronger. It was more than just objects moving around. It was the sense of being watched. I would often catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, shadows flitting across the hallway, a figure darting past the living room window, just out of reach of my direct line of sight. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing. No one. The house felt colder, even when the windows were closed, and the feeling of being followed lingered. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find the front door wide open. I was certain I had locked it that morning, but there it was, hanging ajar. My heart raced as I stepped inside, looking around the dark, silent house. I called out, but there was no response. I checked the entire house, every room, every closet. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone having been there. But the door was wide open, and the air inside was colder than I had ever felt it before. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room, I covered staring at the dark hallway leading to the stairs. I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. I could hear the soft creaking of the floorboards upstairs, and every so often I'd catch a faint whisper just out of earshot. The whispers sounded like words, but I couldn't make them out. They were too quiet, too distant. I decided that the next morning I would leave. I couldn't stay in a place that made me feel so on edge, where I couldn't even be sure if I was alone. But the next morning when I woke up, the house felt normal again. The door was closed, the whispers were gone, and the air didn't feel as cold. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of the move and the breakup were catching up with me. I convinced myself that the house was just old, that it was settling, that there was no reason to be scared. But then the real horror began. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. It was late, and the house was as silent as usual. But this time, it wasn't the usual creaking. These were real footsteps, clear and deliberate. I sat up in bed, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, slowly, methodically. I froze, unable to move. The floorboards creaked under the weight of whoever or whatever was walking down the hallway toward my room. I wanted to call out, to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. I felt paralyzed. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. And then I heard a whisper, a voice, low and raspy, coming from the other side of the door. "Let me in." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in terror, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I knew, deep down, that whatever was on the other side of that door was not human. The door slowly creaked open. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that somehow, if I couldn't see it, it wouldn't be real. The air in the room grew colder, and I felt a cold pressure on my chest, as though something was standing right over me, watching me. I opened my eyes, and for just a brief moment, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It was standing at the foot of my bed, its features blurry, as if it were made of smoke or shadow. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The room fell silent, but I could still feel its presence, lingering in the corners of the room. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things that night and left the house. I didn't care that I was breaking my lease. I just needed to get out. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that house. I don't know if it was a ghost, a spirit, or something else entirely. But whatever it was, I know it wasn't just my imagination. The house on Maple Street is still there, still standing, waiting for someone else to move in. But I'll never be one of them. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I had never been one to believe in ghosts or spirits. I always considered myself a logical person, someone who relied on reason and science to explain the world. That is, until the events that transpired in the old Victorian house I rented on Elm Street. Looking back, I often wish I hadn't moved in there, but at the time, I was just looking for a quiet place to live, away from the noise of the city. The house was beautiful in its own way, large, with high ceilings, creaky floors, and windows that stretched all the way to the floor. It was everything I had wanted in a home, spacious and full of character. But there was one thing that always felt off about it. The house had a kind of stillness, a quiet weight to it, like it was holding its breath. I couldn't quite explain it, but I was determined to make it my own. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Jennings, had warned me that the house was old, that it came with its quirks. He said it had been unoccupied for a few months and that I should expect some strange noises. But I just laughed it off. For the first couple of weeks, everything was fine. The house creaked and groaned like an old building should, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. I would sometimes hear faint footsteps at night, but I chalked it up to the house settling. It was an old house, after all, the kind with narrow hallways and steep stairs. I told myself I was being silly for thinking anything strange was going on. But then, things started getting more uncomfortable. One night, after a long day at work, I arrived home to find the door to the attic open. I was sure I had closed it earlier that day. I had never been up there, and I had no reason to go. The attic was one of those dark, dusty places that was best left undisturbed. But that night, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the narrow stairs. The attic was just as I imagined it, dim, with old furniture covered in white sheets and boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. The air was musty, and the temperature seemed colder than the rest of the house. As I moved further in, I shone my flashlight around, trying to get a better look at everything. But it wasn't the objects that caught my attention. It was the feeling in the air. It felt thick, oppressive. I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. I tried to shake the feeling off and turned to leave, but then something caught my eye. On one of the walls, there was a large faded portrait of a family. I had never seen it before, and it wasn't there when I had first moved in. The people in the picture were all staring directly at me, their expressions cold and unreadable. I don't know why, but something about the picture sent a shiver down my spine. I quickly turned away and hurried down the stairs, determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. The following days were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the unease I felt every time I passed the attic door. I started noticing other strange things. Objects moved slightly out of place, cold drafts where there shouldn't be any, and sometimes when I would walk past a mirror, I would catch a glimpse of something behind me. It was never clear, but I could feel it, like something was there, just out of sight. It all came to a head one night when I was lying in bed, reading a book. The house was as quiet as it usually was, with only the sound of my breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards. But then, from somewhere downstairs, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft at first, like someone walking carefully. I paused, listening intently, my heart starting to race. The steps came closer, and I felt a chill run through me. I was sure I was hearing things, but I couldn't deny that the footsteps sounded real. They were right outside my door now. I was paralyzed with fear, not knowing what to do. My mind screamed at me to get up, to open the door and check, but my body refused to move. Then, just when I thought the steps were about to reach the door, they stopped. There was complete silence. I waited for a long moment, straining to hear anything, but nothing came. Eventually, I managed to find the strength to get out of bed and open the door, but when I looked into the hallway, there was no one there. It was as if the footsteps had never happened. I thought I was losing my mind, but the events didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, the house seemed to grow more and more unsettling. I began hearing whispers at night, soft murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night to find the temperature in my room plummeting, my breath visible in the cold air. I would check the windows, the vents, and the doors, but everything seemed secure. One evening, after an especially long and stressful day, I returned home to find the house unnaturally quiet. No creaks, no whispers, just silence. As I walked through the living room, I noticed the family portrait again, hanging crooked on the wall. I had never noticed it before, but now I could see it more clearly. The eyes of the people in the painting seemed to follow me as I moved, their cold expressions never leaving me. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me and quickly turned away, but something caught my eye. There, on the floor near the portrait, was a small pile of dust. It was strange because I had just cleaned the house the day before. I knelt down to inspect it and immediately froze. Among the dust, there were what looked like small, bloody handprints. They were smeared across the floor, as if someone had dragged their hand along the wood. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I was too scared to move. I stood up quickly, backing away from the spot, my mind racing. The handprints seemed to lead toward the stairs as if someone or something had been walking through the house. I followed the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The handprints stopped at the base of the stairs, and I could feel my breath quickening. I had no idea what to do. I was terrified. The logical part of me told me it was just a prank or a bad dream, but deep down I knew something was wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, the house felt like it was closing in on me. I could hear the creaks, the whispers, and the footsteps again. But this time, they were different. They weren't the soft, tentative steps from before. They were heavy, deliberate. Someone or something was walking through the house, moving from room to room. I could hear it moving upstairs, pacing back and forth. I didn't know how long I lay there, frozen with fear, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Jennings. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. When he finally picked up, I could hear the tiredness in his voice, but I didn't care. I needed answers. I needed to know if anyone had ever died in the house, if there was any reason for all of this. Mr. Jennings, I need to know if something happened here, I stammered. Has anyone ever died in the house? Or is there any history I should know about? There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he spoke. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low. I didn't want to tell you this, but the house has a dark history. A long time ago, a family lived there. Husband, wife, and 2 children. One night, they disappeared without a trace. No one ever found them. There were rumors of something terrible happening, but no one could prove it. The house has been empty for years. I felt my stomach drop. I had heard enough. The footsteps, the whispers, the handprints, it all started to make sense. But I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like I couldn't escape whatever had been haunting the house. The next morning, I packed my things. I couldn't stay there any longer. As I was leaving, I glanced back at the house, the one I had tried to make my home. The windows stared back at me like empty eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still inside, waiting. I never went back to that house. I don't know what I experienced, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, in that house. The terror of knowing that something or someone was always just behind me, lurking in the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I never thought the house I grew up in would become the setting of my worst nightmare. My family had lived there for 3 generations. A large, old colonial house nestled in the quiet suburbs of Pennsylvania. It wasn't a place you'd expect anything strange to happen. But after my father passed away suddenly, everything changed. My mother couldn't handle living there anymore. The memories were too strong, too painful, so she moved in with my aunt. As the eldest son, it fell on me to take care of the house while we figured out what to do with it. I was 25, freshly out of grad school, and just starting a new job, but I couldn't bear to see the house abandoned. I decided to move in temporarily, thinking it would be a way to honor my dad's memory. The first few days were quiet, almost eerily so. The house had always felt warm and alive when Dad was around, but now it seemed hollow and cold. I busied myself with cleaning and organizing, sorting through Dad's things. Sometimes I'd catch a whiff of his cologne or hear the familiar creak of his favorite armchair when no one was there. I told myself it was just my imagination. One night, about a week after I moved in, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I sat up, heart pounding. The house had always made noises, old pipes, shifting wood, but these were unmistakably footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing outside my bedroom door. I listened, paralyzed, as they grew louder, then stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, a knock, the handle turning, but nothing. After what felt like hours, I gathered the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, bathed in the dim glow from the street lamp outside. I checked every room, but nothing was out of place. I convinced myself it was just my grief playing tricks on me. The next night, it happened again. This time, I wasn't alone. My girlfriend Lily was staying over. Around midnight, the footsteps started, slow, heavy, like boots on hardwood. Lily stirred beside me, groggily asking what that noise was. I couldn't answer. I just lay there, gripping her hand, hoping it would stop. But the pacing continued, up and down the hallway. Lily suggested we check it out. She was braver than me, so I followed her as we crept down the hall. The noise had stopped by the time we reached the stairs, but then we heard it again, this time coming from the living room. We descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. I flipped on the light, and there was nothing, just the empty room and Dad's old chair sitting in the corner. Just as I was about to turn off the light, Lily pointed to the window. On the glass, written in condensation, was a single word, leave. We both froze. I wiped the glass clean, trying to find a logical explanation, but Lily insisted we go back upstairs. That night, we barely slept, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Over the next few weeks, the activity became more aggressive. I would find objects moved around the house, picture frames knocked over, the TV turning on by itself. One morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the back door into the kitchen. I checked the door, but it was still locked from the inside. Lily refused to stay over after that. She told me I needed to leave too, but I couldn't. Something about the house felt like it was holding me there, like I was stuck. I started having vivid nightmares, dreams of a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, whispering in a voice that sounded like my father's but distorted, wrong. One night, I woke to the smell of smoke. Panicked, I ran downstairs, but there was no fire. Instead, I found the kitchen light flickering and the smell concentrated near the stove. I thought it might be an electrical issue, but then I saw it, scrawled across the wall in what looked like charcoal. Get out! That night, I slept in my car. I couldn't bear to be in the house. The next day, I called my mother and asked if she had ever experienced anything strange. She hesitated before admitting that Dad had complained about hearing voices and seeing shadows in the weeks before he died. He had brushed it off as stress or lack of sleep. I knew I needed help. I reached out to a paranormal investigator named Frank, a local who had helped families with hauntings before. He arrived the next evening, a calm and pragmatic man in his 50s. Frank walked through the house, his expression growing more serious with each room. In the living room, he stopped by Dad's chair and muttered, "Something happened here." He set up audio recorders, motion sensors, and a thermal camera. As night fell, we sat in the living room, lights off, listening to the silence. Around 1 a.m., the footsteps started again. Frank signaled for me to stay quiet. The footsteps grew louder, moving toward us, but nothing appeared. Then, through the static of the recorder, we heard it, a low, rasping voice saying, "This is my house." Frank paled. He suggested we move to the kitchen. As we did, the temperature plummeted. A loud crash came from upstairs, like something heavy being thrown. We rushed to my bedroom and found my dresser toppled, clothes strewn across the floor. Frank pointed to the mirror. The word "liar" was scratched into the glass. He explained that whatever was in the house wasn't my father, but something pretending to be him, something feeding off the grief and pain lingering in the house. We performed a cleansing ritual that night. Frank burned sage and spoke firmly, telling the entity it wasn't welcome. For a moment, everything seemed to calm down, but then the house erupted in noise, doors slamming, windows rattling. Frank told me to get out while he finished. From outside, I could see the lights flickering, shadows darting around the rooms. After what felt like an eternity, Frank emerged, exhausted. He said it wasn't a simple haunting. It was something darker, something that had latched onto the house long before my family lived there. I left that night and never went back. A few weeks later, the house was demolished, my mother's decision and one I couldn't disagree with. Sometimes I drive by the empty lot, but even now I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that house is still there, waiting for someone else to move in. Story the end.
Story number 11.
My name is Tom, and I've never been much of a believer in ghosts. I grew up in a practical household where unexplained noises were attributed to old pipes or the wind. But after what happened to me, I can't explain it any other way. It all started when I moved into my new place, a small single-story house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a modest fixer-upper with creaky floors and a roof that needed work. But it was mine, and I was proud of it. I had saved for years to afford a place of my own, and moving in felt like a fresh start. My first few days there were normal. I unpacked boxes, scrubbed the floors, and did my best to make it feel like home. I even invited a few friends over for a housewarming party, and we drank beer on the back porch, laughing as the sun set behind the trees. It wasn't until a week later that things started to feel wrong. One evening after work, I came home to find the back door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. I checked the house, room by room, but nothing was out of place. No signs of forced entry, no missing belongings. I chalked it up to being forgetful, locked the door, and went about my night. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, I noticed something odd. A picture frame in the living room had been turned upside down. I didn't remember doing that. I fixed it, shrugged it off, and went to work. When I got home that evening, the frame was upside down again. This time, I felt a chill run down my spine. Maybe it was gravity, a weak nail. I didn't want to think about anything else. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard a faint noise coming from the hallway, a soft, dragging sound. I sat up, straining to hear. My heart pounded as the noise grew louder, closer. I gathered my courage and flicked on the bedside lamp. The hallway was empty. I got up, checking the doors and windows, but everything was locked. The next few days were quiet, and I started to think I had imagined it. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving through the living room and into the hallway. I held my breath, gripping my phone, ready to call the police. I listened as the footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. Silence. I texted my friend Matt, who lived nearby. "Hey, I think someone's in my house." He called me immediately, his voice groggy but concerned. I whispered what was happening and he told me to stay on the line as he drove over. I sat in the dark, barely breathing. Eventually, Matt arrived, banging on the door. I ran to let him in, relief washing over me. We searched the house together, but there was no one there. No open windows, no signs of anyone breaking in. Matt stayed the night on the couch, and I finally got some sleep. The next morning, he joked about how I probably just heard the house settling. I wanted to believe him. But things got worse. One evening, I came home from work to find muddy footprints on the living room floor, bare human footprints leading from the back door to my bedroom. My stomach dropped. I called the police, who came to investigate. They checked the prints, looked for evidence, but found nothing. The officer suggested it might be a prank, maybe some neighborhood kids messing around. I wasn't convinced. The real terror began a week later. I woke up around midnight to the sound of whispers, low, hushed voices like a conversation just out of reach. I couldn't make out any words, but it sounded like two people arguing. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept into the hallway, following the sound to the living room. As I approached, the voices stopped. The room was empty. Then suddenly the TV flicked on by itself, static blaring through the silence. I jumped, nearly dropping the bat. The remote was on the coffee table untouched. I turned off the TV, heart racing, and glanced at the window. That's when I saw it. On the glass, fogged up as if someone had breathed on it, was a single word: leave. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table. I spent that night locked in my bedroom, terrified and alone. I started researching the house, desperate for answers. It took me hours to find anything, but eventually I uncovered a news article from 10 years ago. The previous owner, an elderly man named Harold, had been found dead in the living room. Cause of death: heart failure. The article mentioned that he'd been living alone for years, his family having abandoned him after rumors of him losing his mind. The whispers became more frequent after that. Sometimes I'd hear my own name called out from the kitchen. Other nights I'd find objects moved around, like someone had been going through my things. One morning I found claw marks on the bedroom door, as if something had tried to scratch its way in. I finally broke down and told Matt everything. He agreed to stay with me for a few nights. On the second night, we both heard it. The footsteps. They moved from the living room to the hallway, pausing outside my door. Matt whispered, "Dude, someone's out there." We both listened, barely daring to breathe. Then, without warning, the door slammed open. We both screamed, jumping out of bed. The room was freezing, and I could see my breath. Matt grabbed his phone to record, but the battery died instantly. That's when we saw it. A dark shape in the corner, vaguely human, hunched and distorted. It whispered my name, slowly and deliberately. We bolted out of the house, not stopping until we were in Matt's car. I couldn't go back. I called a priest the next day who agreed to bless the house. He told me the spirit might be restless, angry, or even confused. After the blessing, things seemed to quiet down. The noises stopped, and the sense of being watched faded. I moved out a month later, selling the house to a property developer who planned to tear it down. Part of me felt guilty, like I was abandoning someone who needed help, but the other part knew I couldn't stay, not after what I had experienced. Sometimes I still think about Harold and wonder if he's at peace now, or if he's still there, wandering the empty rooms, whispering at night to anyone who dares to move in. Story the end.